So you've just signed up for a new adventure path, or you and your friends are getting together and you're going to be starting another new campaign. And your GM comes along and says, "We're going to go ahead and meet this Saturday for a session zero." You might not know what a session zero is. And so in this little video, let's go ahead and talk about what you as a player should consider for a session zero. And then if you are a GM, what you should be prepared for in your session zero as well. My name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. So, if you're a player, I really do feel that the session zero might be one of the most important sessions that you are going to be going to, simply because this is where you're going to determine your party's composition. You're going to be determining what those relationships are. You're going to be determining how you are going to work together as a team. And so there are a couple things you might want to have in mind before you go to your session zero. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is you need to be aware on whether you are expected to have a full, partial, or no character creation done whatsoever. And different people will ask for different things. And I'm going to kind of explain a little bit on why you might want any of them. So if it was just going to be a short session zero, you might want to have a full character built up, maybe in Path Builder, maybe in Hero Forge, maybe in one of the other particular builders, simply because, especially if you're playing in a virtual tabletop, you might need to import that character into the virtual tabletop during that session zero. So that might be a reason why you need a full one already built. Partial character creation, you would want, generally speaking, if you knew kind of what you wanted to play, but you weren't sure what the party relationship is going to be, or if maybe you need a certain class skill because you might be the only one with thievery in your party, or you might be the only medic in your party. So you might need to know how you want to allocate those things. But you have the basic ancestry and your class figured out. You might have a couple ideas for background. So that would be considered a partial character creation. And then some, you might not want character creation at all, simply so that you can get the party composition keyed in if that's very important to the particular adventure path you're going to be going on, or the particular homebrewed campaign that you're going on. It is usually up to the GM, and they'll usually tell you beforehand which one of those things they might want. And if you don't know, please don't be afraid to ask. And if, let's say, you're a brand new player going into an adventure path and the GM asks for a full character build because he just wants to import them in, or she just wants to import them in, don't be afraid to ask beforehand if you could get a little help, maybe a session -1, in order to help you build your character with that particular GM. So never be afraid to ask those type of things. The other things you need to be aware of is you're going to be sharing your character details. This is where you're going to determine your party's composition. If you want a party of all frontliners, or if you want a party of all ranged and casters, those can be viable if the campaign is set up right and you guys in your group have kind of thought it out on how you're going to distribute some of these things, if you just want those things. But in general, you're going to want a good mix of martial characters that are up front, some range characters, casters, healing, and any type of utility players that you want. So this might be a good time to decide who's going to be what and who's going to take what role. Also, this might be a good time to determine what your backstory is, simply because you might want to know what the group relationship is. Let's say you are a party of adventurers who have been friends since you were 5 years old. That's part of a backstory, and you need to determine that in this session zero on how you will interact together. Maybe you have 5 people in your party and 2 of them want to be friends from another city who came to this city. Maybe they grew up in Absalom and they are coming to Otaria right now in order to take care of this particular thing with the other 3 adventurers. Well, then those 2 need to get together and determine what their backstory is going to be. And even if you don't want a group backstory or any type of relationships between the players before you start, you could all just meet in a bar. You could meet at the Adventurers Guild and all answer the same call in order to do a task for money. Those are all very viable things. but your individual character needs a backstory as well. And not just your background, but at a minimum, you'd want to know where they're from. You'd want to know what particular things you might want in their background to help you role play. Like maybe they're from a broken home, so they have abandonment issues, or maybe they're deathly afraid of spiders and you need to come up with a reason for that person to be deathly afraid of spiders. These are all the things that you as a player can do in the session zero or do a little bit of prep work before the session zero. But these are generally the things you're going to need for a session zero as a player. I would also recommend that if your GM handed out a player's guide for your particular adventure path specifically, or any pre-information for the campaign, that might be something good to know. And what is usually in those things, we'll take the one for the beginner's vault or the beginner's box, and that would basically tell you who the main NPCs are in Otari, what the general layout of the land is, what some general local lore is, because in most cases, and especially if you're playing the pre-rolled, you are already going to have this information. It might also give you additional background options based on the AP. It might also give you extra lore options based on the AP, as well as a bunch of other things that could be in there. So I would definitely recommend reading any player's guide that you get or any background information that your GM is going to give you before you even start. So with that as a player, let's talk about what the GM should possibly have in mind. So a session zero for a GM is a little bit more work possibly, but you're going to get a lot more information out of it than the players might be. And let's go ahead and discuss what those things could be. So the first one I'll talk about is how and where to play. Are you going to be playing on a virtual tabletop? Are you going to be playing by post? Could you be playing just on Discord using Theater of the Mind, or are you going to be playing live? These are things you want to kind of keep in mind and nail down during your session zero. Maybe what day of the week you're going to be playing, what time, what that location is going to be it a virtual tabletop or just on Discord or live or at someone's house or maybe at your local gaming store. These would be all the things that you would want to have in your session zero. You also want to establish, so not only the date and the time, but how long you expect the sessions to last. If it's a Sunday night, you might not want to have a 4-hour session that begins at 10 o'clock because a majority of people are going to be going to work Monday morning, and even the ones who don't, you don't know whether that's going to work with their schedule. However, work the schedule with all your players. One of the other things you might want to know is, especially if you're playing live, are you going to be using maps and miniatures? Are you going to be playing Theater of the Mind? If you are doing maps and miniatures, you as the GM should probably provide the maps, but are the players bringing their own miniatures? Are you providing them? Are you going to be using tokens? If you're providing the miniatures and someone has their lucky one that they use all the time, can they use that instead? None of these are earth-shattering decisions, but they're all things that still should be discussed. And to tie that last little area, and especially for the live, is you need to discuss with the players what they need to bring. It could be pen, paper, a printed out character sheet. It could be their laptops or a tablet so that they can, because I know some people still like to play live, but they like to use a virtual tabletop for placement and for mapping, because in truth, virtual tabletops do make those things a bit easier as far as setup time, especially if there's a lot of movement around and going to a bunch of different places. So you don't have to stop, reset up the map, reset up the tokens every time they go to a new area. And then there is possibly the most important thing if you're playing live is who's bringing the snacks and what they're going to be. Pizza is great, but by your 16th session and you're still eating the same pizza, it might be fun to have something different. Now, if you're playing virtual, it kind of goes back to that. Are you playing on a VTT, or are you going to be playing on Discord, or is it going to be some other type of chat program? And if it's a VTT, which one you're going to use? There are many out there: Owl Barrel Rodeo, Foundry, Fantasy Grounds, Roll20. Alchemy looks like it's going to be coming out fairly soon. There are a bunch out there, and they're all good for what they are. And you would pick one based on what you want to do and the amount of automation you have. I'm not particularly going to get into that. I am most used to Roll20 and Foundry, and I prefer Foundry simply because it kind of does a lot of the calculations behind you. But Roll20 is coming out with a new front end too, so who knows? And even if you are going to be using a virtual tabletop and not playing in a Discord or some other chat program and doing theater of the mind, well, what chat system are we going to use? Or if you're using a VTT, are you going to be using the built-in chat system and video from the VTT? Or are you going to be using Discord, which is what I usually use, or some other chat program? And then it's also if everybody's familiar with the system and what that log information would be, it might be good to have a little half an hour tune up on how to use things in Foundry or how to use things in Roll20 or how to do things in Owlbear Rodeo if that's what you're using. I know one of the best things that I've ever had a GM do is for our little session 0, they basically set up a small area of the map, and it was an adventure path, but they found a small area that was kind of isolated and said, okay, you're in a locked room with these 4 skeletons. We were all level 1 characters. Let's go ahead and have a mini combat. So in that session 0, we actually did a mini combat. So we learned, okay, our action bar is here. We can go ahead and click on this and our spells are going to be here. Or our strikes. Or if we need to do 3 strikes in a particular round, we need to know to hit this button, then the map -5, then the map -2. So it's a little run through of what, generally speaking, one of the most involved parts of your gameplay is going to be, which is in combat. That was one of the greatest session 0 things I've ever seen. And it took 10 minutes and we killed them obviously fairly quickly, but it was enough monsters to where everybody got about 2 turns and we all got to kind of try out the system. So on your first, second, and third combat, you aren't going in blind, especially if you've never played it before. This would also be a good time to establish your boundaries, basically. And this would be how to play and how to treat each other. There are tools that are provided by Pathfinder in sections of the book, things like the X card and lines and veils. If you want to use those things, great. I personally do. If you don't want to use those things, fantastic. One of the best things about these particular types of games is it is your game, meaning it is the player's game, and you decide how you want to play. But this would be the point where you, as the GM, determine at your table how you want to establish these things, what those rules are. And then the other big thing you need to be aware of is how to handle violations. So if you are going to be a kind of a 0 tolerance GM, and I'm not going to say one way or the other whether that's good or bad, once again, because it's up to the table and it's up to you as the GM. However, then you need to tell them, if you violate this, you're off my table. You establish that at first. That way, when it happens, there's less of a scene or animosity or something going on at that time because you establish at the beginning. If you say that I'm going to give you a warning and then you're out, or it could also not only be just how many strikes a person gets before they're left from the table, if they violate the things that you as a group have decided and you as the GM have decided that you are willing to put up with, it could also be how these violations are handled. And by that, I mean, is it going to be correction at the table? Is it going to be something that you do pull the person aside during the session or pull the person aside at the end of the session? And if there is a violation strong enough, are you going to stop the game right there and handle it? These are all things, and I hate to make you think of these things ahead, but a lot of times in order to prevent animosity, anger, and especially if this is your friend group, destruction of that particular relationship, it might be good to establish these things up front. People invest a lot of time, just like you as a GM would. The players invest a lot of time in their players, especially once they start getting past those first couple sessions and they start getting higher in levels. They've invested a lot of time and they get very attached to them. So your real life friendship might be super strong, but if something happens to something they invest a lot of time in, I'm not saying it's going to destroy a relationship, but it is going to cause some animosity. And it'd be good to have these particular boundaries set in stone, how they are addressed, how they are handled out in the open at the beginning. And that's kind of where I'll leave it at that. I will also bring up one more time, though. Do bring up and establish what your boundaries for the table are. And if you don't have boundaries, you can say that too, but make sure that all your players are in agreement with it as well. The other thing you want to cover is how to handle player absences. Let's say you have yourself and 5 other players. One player doesn't show up. Does another player play that character, or does the GM play that character, or did that player get called back to town to go talk to the mayor for some reason? How will XP be distributed to a player that wasn't at that particular session? And let's say you establish at your table that if 2 people aren't going to make it that week, then you cancel the session. Are you canceling, or can you do a side quest with the remaining characters? One of the other things that I have had come up recently, and it was for a fairly brutal campaign that I'm playing. We basically rolled up secondary characters already, kind of in our session 0. Didn't necessarily put the amount of backstory and care into it. However, what we're doing with that is if you die, and in this particular campaign, there's a chance of you permanently dying. Not like 50% chance, but it's a higher chance than it would be on a normal one. We will do side quests with our secondary characters so that the other players at the table are aware of what you're playing. You're aware of what they're playing. Plus, these aren't random things that you're bringing in at the last minute to an established group. And what we're actually doing, and it's kind of interesting, is our main player characters are Team A and our secondary characters are Team B, and they are aware of each other's existence. So if player from Team A dies and we bring player from Team B up from the backbench up to the top team, Team A is already aware of that player in Team B. So it's an interesting concept. It's something you might want to think about. How you're going to handle leveling. Now, there are 2 main ways that people do it, and that's XP versus milestone. And once again, bring that up. XP for a player when there is an absence, do they get it or not? These would be all things to establish. As far as the debate between XP and milestone, it depends on the path you're playing. It depends on the GM. It depends on a bunch of different things. If you're playing Abomination Vaults, I kind of think milestone's better. As you get through different levels, no more spoils than that. If you are doing a homebrew, you might not know because it is a homebrew and this might be the first time it's being played. XP might be good in that particular case until you establish that maybe milestones might be better. However, if that's something like that, if you're concerned something that might happen, like you're not certain which one you want to use, I would suggest starting with XP. But in your session 0, but then in your session 0, bring up to the players that at a certain point we might switch to milestone. If you set the expectations in your session 0, I'm wording it a weird way, but you can get away with a lot if you set up the expectation in your session 0. One of the other things you want to bring up is what rules are being played, and by that I mean what variants or what homebrewed variants you're going to play. Are you going to be playing free archetype or not? Are you going to be rolling your characters up different or not? Are you going to be playing a variant of the free archetype where instead of at level 2, it happens at level 4 and every 4 levels after that? So there's all these different things that you could possibly establish at that time. Just let everybody know what variants you're going to be playing throughout the game. You might bring up the player's guide that you handed out to your players before the session started and ask for any questions, anything they might want to come up. That's a good reason to hand out the player's guide before your session 0. If you're giving it to them the session 0, give them 10, 15 minutes to read it and then ask if they have any questions. Then the other particular thing you'd want to bring up in your session 0, this would probably be your last, but by no means less important, it would be what the players like to play. You as a GM have a certain style, certain things you like to create, certain ways you like to present things. But if you are a role play heavy GM and you ask your players and none of them like to role play and they just want to be a straight action type table, There's going to be some issues with everybody having as much fun as they possibly could, and you could come to a middle ground. You might want to ask if your players like puzzles and how hard or how much. If a puzzle is going to take an entire 3 hour session to solve, that might be too much for some player groups, while other groups might love it. Some player groups might love not rolling a dice for 2 or 3 sessions in a row and have it all be role play, while others like to play a combat Diablo style combat simulator. So these would be things you would establish during your session 0 in order to figure out what everybody likes so everybody can have as good a time as they possibly could as you're interacting with each other. I hope this little part on session 0 kind of gave you some things to think about or things you might do or maybe bring into your own session 0. I do honestly feel that the session 0 is one of the most important sessions, especially at the beginning of the campaign, to set all the expectations and to answer any questions that players might have. So I do hope you invest a little bit of time into it, either as a player or as a GM. And I don't want to oversell it too much, but take the process seriously and make sure you're ready for that session 1 so you can go ahead and get started on your adventure. So we're going to go ahead and close it out with that. So I hope you guys have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.